Welcome to a tutorial video on JavaScript and Ink. In this video, I'm going to talk about building an interface. Across this entire series of videos, we've talked about different ways of working with the story API. We saw that we can use CanContinue to see if there's more of the story. We can call the continue function to get the next chunk of story and load the next choices. We can also interact with and change the values of variables. Since they're in the global state, we can look at the variable state interface and change or get those values if we want. We can also, as I talked about in the previous video, use the evaluate function to evaluate certain functions and send in different data. And as I talked about at the very end of the last video, we can build an interface through putting functions into Ink, then calling those functions from JavaScript and giving it data to do something with. And I talked a little bit about building this interface, as this video is going to talk about a lot more, through putting things into Ink, then putting things in the JavaScript, and having them talk to each other, knowing what the two code bases are doing, but allowing them to work with their own code and their own data. So to start then, let's look at the Ink code for this. We see at start we have three different variables, lines 1, 2, and 3. Then we have some text, and then we have our first divert and our first not here choices. We see if water is less than 1, we go to out of water. Otherwise, we keep doing choices. Down here, though, we see a whole bunch of functions. I've cut up all of this functionality into different functions because this isn't going to play in Ink, it's going to play from JavaScript. JavaScript's going to interface with the Ink code, not caring how Ink is doing things, but calling functions to get it to do different things. We see here go north, go south, go west, go east, set X, set Y, set current position, drink water, current water, all of these different functions. And from the JavaScript side, I don't particularly care how Ink is doing things, although I wrote all of the code. So we know Ink has got stuff going on, and we know it's got functions. So then we just call those functions, get Ink to do stuff, and then check what data comes back out. So, okay, we've got all of this Ink code. I put it into Inky. I compiled it into a JSON file. Or I could have compiled it in the JSON file, that is, but because I'm using this in a web interface, I actually compiled it into a story.js file. Let's look at the difference between those. I mentioned this in a very early video, the first one of this series, that when we do the Ink for web, what it does is sets a variable, story content, to the content of that JSON file, which is the rest of this file right here. But we don't really need to care about any of that. What is important, though, is that we have this variable story content. Now, I mentioned way back at the first video that looking at the Ink for Web file gives us a way to think through these interfaces and think through using this. I'm going to use all of those ideas as well as the previous stuff we've covered throughout this video series and put it all together in this single example and talk about ways that we can build more interesting HTML and JavaScript interfaces and using Ink as a background, as a narrative layer, or as a dialogue system. So right here, I'm using a similar thing we've seen throughout here. I'm loading that JSON content. In this case, we know it's within the variable story content. Because this is within a browser setting, we're using ink.js.story instead of using story directly as we did in Node. Then we're getting the elements of the story, water, position, and north IDs. And then the rest of this, lines 8 through 36, are 4 different event listeners. And we're listening for click for the 4 different buttons. I'm going to go ahead and jump to the right for a second and then come back into the code. Go north, go south, go east, and go west are the 4 buttons we're looking at. In each case, when they are clicked, it calls the evaluate function in Ink. So we've got the HTML interface, we've got the JavaScript running behind that, and the JavaScript is listening for these user events. When these user events happen, it calls the Ink code. And then notice we're using choose choice index. I mentioned this way back at the beginning as well, that every time we look at current choices, we get the text and they're indexed. We use that index, as I mentioned, to feed back into Ink. That's what I'm doing right here. So I'm saying, okay, evaluate this function. The function's going to go do something. And then I'm going to say, okay, choose choice index 0. Coming back to ink, let's look at what that means. We're in choices, that's the first knot we've landed in, and our first and only choice is to keep going, which cycles us through choices. So this allows us to create a looping structure within ink, while we're also calling different functions within ink at the same time. Our functions are doing different things in ink, and then we're looping the ink function. We're doing things and then looping, doing things and then looping. So that's what's going on in all these event listeners. Then at the end of all these, I'm calling continue story. And look, it highlighted that in each of these cases. Let's scroll down and look at that. Down here, continue story, lines 46 through 59. So it's calling story that continue, as we've seen in all of these examples, to get the next chunk. Then we're creating a paragraph element, setting an inner HTML, and then appending it, which is actually what this text is over here on the right-hand side, that initial text every time, which we know every time we loop, the text wouldn't change, but if it ever does, it probably means we're out of that loop. The other two things it's doing is refresh water and refresh position. Let's look at refresh water. Now, I mentioned in the other videos that when we call the evaluate function, that we can actually get back the result. This is an example of that. We're calling current water, we're sending in no parameters, and we're setting true. True means we want the data that is returned. And so we're getting the output from that. It will return an object. The object property contains whatever that data is. So we're okay. Every time we're setting water element, which is way up here, water, this right here, remaining water 20. Every time we go through this loop within ink, we want to go ahead and set this to whatever current water returns for us. Now let's pause here and go look at current water in ink. Current water in ink is lines 62 through 63 here. So it returns the text remaining water and returns the value of the variable water, which we know is set way up here. And if it ever changes, we'll see that updated. So we're currently seeing the result of calling a function in ink, getting its return data, and then using it, which we see right here. We want its output, not its return data. So we're looking at its output, and we're saying, okay, whatever it outputs, tell me, and I will use something. I will use it, in this case, inner HTML. The next thing at the bottom was refresh position, line 57. It does the same thing. It's looking at current position within the ink. Whatever its output is, we're then saving and using that. Let's pause here and jump back to ink. Current position is returning currently at, and then the X and Y values, which we see right here, currently at 20 and 20. So we see then that we can create an interface layer by using HTML to create the presentation, using JavaScript to run that interactivity, and then calling the ink system and evaluating different functions, either getting its output or knowing the function is doing something else. This is a bridging of these two systems. We've got JavaScript running everything, but it's talking to the Ink API that's handling all the dialogue, all the calculations, and JavaScript is just changing HTML depending on whatever Ink says. So let's see all of this in action. So over here on the right-hand side, I have that HTML running. Click Go North. Notice our remaining water went down. We're currently at 20 and 19. 18, we can go south, build that number back up. Go east for a while. Go west a bit, go east some more. And we see finally the text changed. I shook my canteen but could tell it was empty. This was the last step in my journey. So let's take that, jump back over to ink, and figure out where that was. That happened right here, out of water, which we see was the check that happened every time this knot looped. We checked to see if water was ever less than 1. If it ever was, we immediately went to the knot out of water, right here, which meant this was done. We try clicking these buttons. Nothing happens because we cannot continue in the story. The story on the ink side is done. Because it is done, we can no longer choose this to continue. Therefore, continue story no longer works. We no longer refresh water. We no longer refresh position, and everything comes to a halt. So, to review, we can use the Ink for Web examples within the Inky editor file Ink for Web to look at how it works with the API. We can also develop our own interfaces by looking at API using things like continue, variable state, evaluate function, and use these in different ways to build our own interfaces in HTML using JavaScript to work with Ink in a browser setting. We can also, as we saw in the previous videos, just use JavaScript to work with Ink in a node setting to just do different things and examine a story. Finally, to build more complex projects, we can put functions into Ink, call them from JavaScript, and either look at their output or get them to do different things, and to design these two systems separately. Design everything within Ink, and then use a JavaScript layer to run it all, calling those functions, doing different things. Or we could do it the other way and put everything into Ink, and then let JavaScript run all that, changing variables, changing their values, calling functions, looking at different texts as well. Two different approaches to the problem, either putting everything in Ink and letting JavaScript talk to it, or putting a lot more into JavaScript and letting JavaScript sort of talk to Ink and guide it along. Two different approaches of using two different systems for however a developer or author wants to approach this problem. However, we can see here that we can easily build an interface, putting the complexity in either system or distributed across the two, depending on how we want to design and approach that problem. Thanks for watching.